everyone, welcome back. We're here to do another episode of Revisiting the Road to Serfdom. Thanks for being here. Kevin and I are this week, we're going over Chapter 9, Security and Freedom. But for the folks at home who might have missed it, Kevin, why don't you tell people a little bit about what we talked about last time in Chapter 8 to kind of bring them up to speed.
So episode 7, we covered chapter 8, as long as that's not super confusing for everyone. The title of the chapter is Who Whom. So this comes from a phrase popularized by Lenin during the early years of the Soviet Union, answering the universal problem of the socialist society, which is who plans whom, who directs and dominates who assigns to other people their station in life, and who is to have his due allotted by others. These become the central issues to be decided by the central power. So the whom really just comes down to who's controlling your life, right? And this is the central question if you're going to be in a socialist society, but doesn't even really have to be a question asked if you live in a free society, free liberal society. So
it's who plans whom, basically. If
Exactly.
the planners want to create planning, who plans whom, who's being planned, who's having their life planned for them, and who gets to do the planning.
For sure. And I guess real quick, while we go through this, when I say liberal society, I think we have to mention this at the top every single time. Liberal in the 19th century European sense, which you are against any coercion by centralized authority. But the liberal that you hear of now in the American sense is almost the exact opposite. It's like, please provide me security, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And I'll trade in my freedom as long as I feel safe.
Yeah, I'm glad you remember to do that, the definitions. Yeah, so liberal, think libertarian, conservative, in maybe our modern parlance, in the parlance of the times, as the dude might say. And same with planning. So planning, think a top-down, organized society. Planning is, so if you want to put a face on planning, AOC. AOC is someone who wants a planned society. Green New Deal, we're going to plan the different, like what you can and can't drive and all this other stuff. It's top-down authority, total control of the society, planning everything down, to what job you can have, where you can live, and those kinds of things. So that's planning, just bureaucratic bloat. Anyway, I'm glad you remember that.
I'm also glad that we are like a really professional podcast here, because when you said AOC's face, you didn't say anything about horses or anything like that. That would be an awful, horrible podcast, and we're not about that here. Okay, guys.
Correct. I didn't mention a ghoulish, fake crying out front of, a parking lot at an immigration center.
Yeah,
I didn't
wearing all white like she's in an
things.
R&B video. That would be awful.
Correct. Yeah, I would never do something like that.
Provide your comments below. Number 2 that went over the last chapter is, up to this point, Hayek talks about democracy, the economy, and the general freedom, but now he actually gets into how society actually breaks down. It was kind of more in the abstract before, what could lead to this possibility. He does, kind of relate it to what happened in Germany leading up to Nazism. But now he kind of shows how it can break down in basically every society. So he says planning doesn't end in the economic sphere or just control how we consume or produce, but it also must control every aspect of our lives, including whether or not we are worthy of contributing to society in any meaningful way. When people say we're just planning the economy, it's a small section of your life. We'll just take care of that stuff. You don't have to worry about clothing or food or shelter. Like, we'll just take care of that. Understand, it doesn't stop in the sphere of the economy. It will bleed into everything else, because economy is really just how we behave with each other. And you have to control the behavior as a whole if you plan on controlling the economy in any way.
It's as possible to compartmentalize that idea as the modern equivalent. We're going to mention, here's your keyword today. Everyone, take a shot whenever you hear this if you want to have fun. COVID. But it's as possible to compartmentalize just the economy, economic life from all the other aspects of life, in the same way that it's like, hey, leave just let the COVID response. It's just let them handle the virology. That's it. It won't impact anything else. Just let Dr. Fauci and whoever else, they'll just handle the virology, and we see where that's led. Where it's all of these other aspects of
life. Our
life.
Politicians say, listen to the science, which now bleeds into politics. And then, like we've talked about in previous chapters, is like, beware when they said we're going to let the experts handle this. It's like, well, no, the experts are not often elected. And they also are very hyper-focused on this one thing, where they will absolutely say, all right, we're going to take out this Delta variant at any cost, whether we had to shut down school, another lost year of education for young children. That's the cost that you pay to make sure that we don't get the sniffles.
And we will put an asterisk here whenever Kevin says another year of education. That is not, we don't want to offend anyone. That's not to actually imply that kids are receiving education in our public education system.
Good.
We just use that as a proxy for the public education system.
Yeah.
So
something
we
that
don't want anyone to get
identifies as education.
right. We don't want to get anyone the misconception that we actually think that the education system provides quality education.
But the last little note on there is a phrase that I think I only uses once, but I think is kind of brilliant, that we forgot what unfreedom means. So we're not scared to give up these freedoms because we're like, well, it's the people who believe that freedom is this default condition, that everyone like understands freedom and wants freedom. While anyone who's read, the Gulag Archipelago understands how people don't automatically believe in freedom. They're totally okay with giving up their freedoms if they think that's what they ought to do or that's what they're born into. So we're being kind of conditioned in a way that we're starting to understand freedom, at least in a different way, if just not understanding it all, and say freedom's sometimes a bad thing, right? It's the Nazi slogan, free from freedom, that was really, really compelling to the people, right? So because freedom comes with this risk and responsibility that can be really scary. And it's much more comfortable having that security. And the third part, he also covers the bait and switch that we're all too familiar with today between equality and greater equality. This is just more more equal distribution is really what greater equality is. We're trending toward that direction. And as so many socialist linguistic games, this is yet another way of getting people to forfeit their freedoms in exchange for something entirely different than they were promised, really results in everyone is equally poor, equally miserable, and equally homeless now. And, we see that bait and switch there, which today's bait and switch is now equality for equity. And people are not understanding the differences between those two. And those are the subtle linguistic games that will catch us off guard.
100%. Yeah, no, that's a great summary. Chapter 9 is about security and freedom. So as Hayek does such a good job of laying these foundations and comparing, what's that Thomas Sowell, one of the questions he always asks is as opposed to what, is one of the big three he asks. And so Hayek compares tensions between different ideas, I think, really well. And this chapter he gets into the security and freedom and the tensions between those two things. And this was one of the ones, so I think in the introduction, we talked about how Hayek was actually like really well known for taking his the criticisms of him very seriously, trying to be really charitable in how he responds to a lot of those criticisms and just trying to take him seriously. And so I think this chapter is one of those places where you can see that he is not obfuscating or punting on any of these criticisms or on any of the problems that socialists are trying to answer. But he's just trying to say, look, your premise isn't necessarily wrong, and we'll get into what he means specifically there, but your answer is wrong, as we see so many times with this type of stuff. But this chapter, he's basically trying to answer give a response to the socialist answer to this question, not the premise. So I'll give you the question basically as framed by this guy, H.J. Lasky, who clearly Hayek does not like. He's quoted him multiple times, a well-known socialist. But so here's a quote by Lasky. It says, "Those who know the normal life of the poor, its haunting sense of impending disaster, its fitful search for beauty, which perpetually eludes, will realize well enough without economic security, liberty is not worth having." And so the point is you'll hear this argument today is that, look, if you don't have any economic security, what kind of freedom or liberty do you really have? And so you'll hear, you've heard AOC say these things. You've heard Bernie Sanders say these things where it's like, okay, but what good is freedom if you're so poor that you can't actually do anything with it? And so Hayek, this chapter is completely dedicated to Hayek saying, look, that is a valid point, that you have to have some answer, some response, some way of dealing with abject poverty, acts of God, like, calamities that no one can foresee or prepare for necessarily. But the socialist answer to these things is not a valid one. It's not a good one, because the socialist might say, or the someone like Lasky might say that if you have no economic security but you have all this freedom, it's like being in jail where you have this free time and you can go roam around the yard, but you just have this little limited space you can move around. So it's like, how free are you actually? And Hayek's point is that if you give away all of your freedom to get some new sense of total security, you end up back where you started, where you have this security, but you're in this little limited space that you can't get out of. So it's the same problem. And his point is, look, these socialists, their answer to things like, calamities, just natural disasters or whatever, unforeseen job loss, will end up in this society that is characterized, and he gives two quotes. One of them is by Nikolai Lenin, the other one's by Leon Trotsky, two famous communist leaders. And the Lenin quote is, the whole of society will have become a single office and a single factory with equality of work and equality of pay. And the Trotsky quote, which is the one that's, I think, much better encapsulates the practical realities of what these people like Lasky are advocating for, is, quote, in a country where the sole employer is the state, opposition means death by slow starvation. The old principle, who does not work shall not eat, has been replaced by a new one, who does not obey shall not eat. And so Trotsky wrote that in 1937, and Hayek is saying, look, we're going to get into the practical realities of this problem, but your answer is going to lead to this system, where Trotsky is saying, look, you can have total security where you'll get all the food, you'll be insured food, which even that is a dubious promise at best in a lot of these systems. But we'll make sure you're secure with your food as long as you obey and give in to the planners and the dictates of the planners. So anyway, so that's the fundamental issue that Hayek is trying to address here. And I think he does a really good job of just setting that up in terms of he doesn't ignore the problem, which I think is a testament to his character, really.
Yeah. And I think when we kind of break down Lasky, Lenin, Trotsky, I think their central idea is security is a prerequisite of liberty, where the influence is really in the other direction, that you have to have liberty if you want security. And that's really where they break down. But when you read this quote, it kind of reminds me of the idea taken from the previous chapter when he quotes, who will deny that a world in which the wealthy are powerful is still a better world than the one in which only the already powerful can acquire wealth. What it reminds me here is it kind of changes the dynamic of the wealth dynamic to basic necessities like food, where you can rewrite that previous quote to read, who will deny that in a world in which those who work for it can put food on the table is still a better world than one in which only those who obey the powerful can eat. This is the inevitable future of this when you have all this security, but absent of this freedom and liberty. And, I think that, it always looks like you got to work for your food, but there's some people who can't do it. So, it kind of pulls at your heartstrings. This is probably not an area where we want to go. If people can't work, there's not gonna be able to get food on the table. We want some security for them. But in a world that's the opposite, where everyone gets food supplied for them, well, okay, that supply can easily get cut off arbitrarily. They can pick and choose. And as we'll go through, throughout the chapter, you'll kind of see, how the different ways that when they take control of this sector, although it seems like a small sector here, they can really take control of everything and take control of those basic necessities. They're called necessities for a reason, right? They're necessary. So even though it seems small to take care of these small necessities, now they've just gained control of what's necessary for you to live. So it's extremely important to understand that and see that before you give up all of those freedoms. But yeah, so he gets into actually the meat of, at the beginning of the chapter here, quote, when security is understood in too absolute a sense, the general striving for it, far from increasing the chances of freedom, becomes the gravest threat to it. So he puts, he says we must put limits on security provided by centralized power so it does not become a threat to freedom. Hayek is more open to security provided by government than most might give him credit for. And actually, I believe Lasky is one of the people who really, really harshly criticized this book because he claimed no, he's a laissez-faire absolutist. There's, he rejects any sort of security provided by government for people who just have an unfortunate hand dealt to them. No, that's not the case. He does play around with these ideas, and he does go on to, in the next quote we'll go through here, that he does split this idea of security into two different kinds of security. And so it's not just this one uniform idea of all security or no security. There are conditions in between those that may be appropriate for a centralized power to take care of.
Yeah. So I want to just briefly go back to this quote that you read here to at least give people maybe some further explanation of it. When he says, when security is understood in too absolute a sense, the general striving for it being security, far from increasing freedom, becomes the gravest threat to it. So he's saying that if you understand the concept of security in too absolute a sense, like in other words, if you're trying to eliminate all risk from your life, all chance, all anything like that, it doesn't actually increase your freedom. It circles back around and makes it where that striving for total absolute security, total absolute lack of risk or chance, becomes the biggest threat to your freedom. Like think of someone who's like an agoraphobic or germophobic or something like that. Like they're trying to increase their security so much that they end up stuck in their own house, afraid to go outside, afraid to interact with anything, germs or anything like that. I think about that. Do you remember that old Lonely Island song, YOLO, where they like flipped the meaning of it?
Yeah.
So they took the YOLO, you only live once, and put it as like, therefore you need to beware of all threats and danger, and couches are going to, I got one word about furniture, killing machines, and at the end, they're all like in their apartment, like with tinfoil hats on, saving piss and mason jars and stuff, because it's like, I only live once. I got to remove all threats. And so therefore I have no freedom because I've become so beholden to this notion of absolute security. But that's what he's saying there, is that it sounds counterintuitive, but you have to find the right balance. And this is where personal choice comes in, between how much risk you are willing to bear individually. And that has a direct relationship to your own freedom. But we'll get into a quote that literally says this, where it's like, either you have both of those things or you bear none of those things when it comes to both risk and freedom. But that's what he's getting into here. So he, like you said, he contrasts two different kinds of security. One of them's limited, one of them's absolute. And the absolute security, that's the one you got to be wary of, although the limited one, like you said, could possibly lead to that. And we'll get to that in a minute. So Hayek says, quote, "It will be well to contrast at the outset the two kinds of security: the limited one, which can be achieved for all, and which is therefore no privilege, but a legitimate object of desire, and absolute security, which in a free society cannot be achieved for all, and which ought not to be given as a privilege, except in a few special instances, such as that of judges, where complete independence is of paramount importance. These two kinds of security are, first, security against severe physical privation, the certainty of a given minimum of sustenance for all. And second, the security of a given standard of life." So I'm going to pause there really fast. So he's saying, look, the first one is like severe privation. Do you have a place to live? Do you have food? And so basic necessities, like you said. The second one, the absolute security, is like, are you guaranteed a certain standard of life, which is a very different thing, very different thing. This is where you get into like arguments for UBI and other idiotic proposals. So he says, or as we may put it briefly, the security of a minimum income, there we go, and the security of a particular income a person is thought to deserve. So this is subjective. We shall see presently that this distinction largely coincides with the distinction between the security which can be provided for all outside of and supplementary to the market system, and the security which can be provided only for some and only by controlling or abolishing the market. So limited security, security against basic life-threatening circumstances, starvation, disease, whatever. Absolute security, guaranteed of a given standard of life. UBI, government-sponsored jobs guarantee. Where have we heard about that? Everything's infrastructure. Is this infrastructure? Is that infrastructure? What isn't infrastructure?
Racism.
I saw a butterfly today. Is this infrastructure? So it's that meme. Is this infrastructure? The butterfly. So anyway, those are the two different things he's talking about here. And I think that, especially at the end there, he does raise an interesting question about limited security, absolute security as two different things. So yeah, I don't know, but go ahead with what your thoughts are on that. But there's an interesting point he brings up here that's probably worth talking about.
Yeah. I mean, you went over it really well. I think, the limited security part is where you take care of the people who, there's some people who just have a rough, hand dealt to them, that they can't take care of a lot of these different things. A lot of more able-bodied people who are what would be considered now privileged, but not privileged in the sense that he uses it here. There's a very important distinction that I think I get to later, but I can say it now, that the privilege that he gets into here is like privilege by arbitrary law or rule that actually gives people, like you think of a white privilege. White privilege was definitely a thing in the Jim Crow South because there were explicit laws, giving a certain group advantages over another group. Where privileges here is just like, okay, I'm privileged enough to grow up with parents who are well off. So now, I have more options available to me. So that's the problem with limited securities. It starts to bleed into, all right, well, what limits do you put on there? Do you put limits on people who are just born with a disease that does not allow them to go in the workforce? Okay, that's a reasonable limit there. But now do you expand the scope of the limits to people who just grew up in a poor household? Okay, well, now we're expanding this. Now you're starting to move from, this protecting against life-threatening circumstances to now guaranteeing a standard of life that you talked about there. And now you branch it out to UBI, government-sponsored job programs, which I think is kind of insane to me, and all these other guarantees that this blanket of security has that's going to add all this noise into a free market that's now you're going to have a public sector really competing with the private sector, and you're going to get all kinds of problems that stem from that. But I think there's a larger question here, when it comes to Hayek giving ground and saying, okay, maybe there is a role for this limited security. The question that I think we would have if he were here, if we were able to interview him, is like, what should any power guarantee any sort of security at all? I mean, Hayek believes so by stating there's no reason, this is a direct quote from the book, there's no reason why in a society which has reached a general level of wealth, which ours has attained, the first kind of security should not be, the first kind being limited security, should not be guaranteed to all without endangering general freedom. So this is kind of a talking point you hear from the left now a little bit too, right? This is how they kind of gain ground into that limited security territory, and then they make ground into toward the absolute security territory, right? You have to guarantee a minimum wage before you jump to UBI. You can't just jump from 0 to 100. It's very difficult to get there, so you got to ramp up in some sort of way. So really the question here is, should any sort of security, limited or absolute, be guaranteed by a centralized authority? Can we get around that? Is there some sort of communal response instead of a government-sponsored response that should be obligated to take care of people who, again, have a bad hand in life, who are not able to do certain things? Or should we allow this limited security to be sponsored by the government?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, right? And that's the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these rights is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so our founders understood that the role of government is to secure those rights, right? So provide a system where you have the security to pursue those rights and to act within those rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which one could certainly, I think, derive a concept of a standard of living from that. But it seems much more likely to me that the government's response, because that's the ultimate question here. It's not, should there be an entity that helps facilitate these things, but is it the government's job to do it? And Hayek is saying, look, we've reached a certain level of material wealth, and you hear Bernie Sanders say this, call me crazy, but in the wealthiest country in the world, where the top 1% billionaires could thing, I think it's safe to say that everyone should be given a 40-inch flat screen TV, or something ridiculous like that. And so they use those arguments. It's like, because we're so wealthy, people use the, if we can put a man on the moon, we can do X or whatever thing, as if they're one-for-one comparisons. But the point is it's like, sure, we should have entities that can help with this thing, but can the government do that? And the problem is that we see so oftentimes is that there's no logical conclusion, there's no logical endpoint, there's no guardrails to what it looks like, because these are all completely subjective definitions, and it changes. And there is this book, the two books that really influenced my thinking on welfare programs, nanny state kind of things, are The Tragedy of American Compassion and The High Cost of Good Intentions. And The Tragedy of American Compassion gets into, that's a book that's more like, talks about religious charities and stuff, and how in the 1800s there used to be these two terms that are kind of unpopular. I've talked about this before, but well, they'd be unpopular now. Back then they weren't. But it was like the deserving versus undeserving poor. And it was like, okay, there are these churches and like different civic organizations that they weren't government things, that were dedicated to helping people like get back on their feet if something happened. But the deserving poor was like, this bad thing happened. I just want to get back to where I can live my life, and that's are they trying to work? Are they trying to do this other stuff? And those were places where it'd be like soup kitchens where there were requirements of you being there. It's like, they would have like a program where you would work doing these things, or were you looking for a job? And then the government comes along and creates these ones where there's no requirements to get food. It's like, of course, people are going to pick that. And so, yeah, there were, like you said, communal responses to these things. But the other problem in the high cost of good intentions that he lays out is, and this is where my main criticism of like Hayek's point here would stem from, is that you create a circle. And the problem that, I forget what the author's name is of that book, but it's a fantastic book, where it's the no less worthy argument. So anytime you create a system where you have people that are getting a benefit from the government, you just drew a circle, and these are the people receiving it, and then everyone outside the circle are those who are not receiving it, right? But whenever you create a circle, you have people on the fringes of that who are barely not eligible to receive that benefit. And so then these people come along and say, well, they're no less worthy than this. Those who are barely inside the circle and those who are barely outside the circle of receiving these benefits of this, limited security. Who's to say, the distinction is so minuscule here. Why wouldn't we expand it to include them? And ultimately they do. The argument that the author of that book uses originally, he talks about like benefits for soldiers of the Revolutionary War and then the War of 1812 and then the Civil War and how it expanded out and out and out. And he includes the example that I think is incredible, at least when the book was written, which wasn't that long ago, is that there was a person living today, or at least again when that book was written, within the last 10 years, who was receiving Civil War pension of Civil War soldier, because it was a Civil War veteran who in the early 20th century had a kid with someone who's really young, and that kid was still alive. And because of the extension of benefits, they were getting, it was like maybe like $56 a month. But the point is that when you create the circle and you include those who are no less worthy, all you did was just create another group who's no less worthy. Right. And so then the cycle repeats until it eventually includes like, things that don't make any sense in there. But that's the natural progression of these things. That's the argument that we've talked about with the conservatism arguing for 0, the progressives arguing for 10. They settle on 5. The next iteration is not 5 to 10, but 5 to 15, settle on 10. So I think it's probably safe to say that, and, I don't know, you tell me what you think here, that Hayek would maybe, if he saw what they've done today in the natural progression of how they've expanded out these standards that are just so vaguely stated and totally subjective that they can just make an argument for them, and get people to agree because they sound nice, that he probably would not, or at least he would have a lot of asterisks on this idea of guaranteeing, at least a government guaranteeing limited security, because of how it expands out and out and out until it's just completely insane. And we're seeing this like with what's the government's trying to guarantee this security now with rent relief and all of these payments and stuff. And it's absolutely destroying the economy. So I think it's good that he's trying to answer the question, and trying to deal with like this. And again, it speaks to his character and his intellectual honesty. But the idea that the government has to be the one to do that, as opposed to, like you said, some kind of communal response or having a family, anything like that, any non-NGO type thing, I think is naive. And honestly, I don't know why he didn't include that. I don't know why he said that the government needs to be the guarantor of it instead of saying we just need a mechanism to do this. I frankly don't know why he did that.
Well, he's going to go into some more tangible stuff here in a little bit, but just to comment on what you said there is this, you're talking about this limited blanket expanding out into the absolute blanket, of security. And I think, when he talks about that there are ways to have a limited security, that must mean there's some sort of limiting principle. And the limiting principle is if it does not infringe on competition, then it's okay. But once it starts infringing, okay, you can't do that anymore. The problem is people will, and as he explains in here, people will abandon that limiting principle and be willing to take the absolute security because it's become part of the culture. He continues on a little bit here that not only, and really what came from the other quote is not only when you start with making policies of security that promote security, you start to get people dependent and, rewire the mind to be like, okay, this limited freedom is okay. I can live with it. I can survive with it. Let's continue apace here and try to build prosperity through security. And by that time, it's already gonna be too late. So limiting principle is going to fail. But he does get into some stuff here that is much more, like I said, tangible and that I think is going to kind of broaden our disagreement with him. But I do think that there's a difference if he had wrote the book today compared to writing it in 1944 to give him some sort of leeway there. But so he goes on talking about the combating what he calls general fluctuations in the market. He gives example of large scale unemployment and how there might be a place for government solutions that are not incompatible with 19th century liberalism, like I explained before. Examples he gives are changes to monetary policy and temporary increase in public works projects. We've seen increase in public works projects before. What was it, infrastructure that will boost the public works projects. I also think FDR, New Deal.
He knew about that too. Yeah. He knew about the Tennessee, Tennessee River Valley Authority or whatever. And so he knew about those things. He knew what abject failures they were. So it's weird he even brings these things up without criticizing them further. I don't know. Sorry to interrupt.
I understand his monetary policy because he lived in a time that we weren't so interconnected with different currencies and stuff like that. So I understand that, but yeah, public works is like, man, you got to you've lived through what happens when you expand those too much. And only if you know now how much of a saint they've made FDR with the New Deal is pretty insane. But he continues to say, quote, through its solution will require much planning in the good sense. It does not, or at least need it not, require the special kind of planning which, according to its advocates, is to replace the market. So Hayek does mention that solutions like the increase in public works, like we said, might increase the volume of government expenditures, but he basically says that we must be careful. And the problem is, I don't think we can ever be careful enough when using public dollars. You use $1 here to pay for some sort of public assistance, like the clamoring again, that limited blanket's going to continue to expand because people on the outside looking in are like, okay, why don't I get that? I'm missing it just by a little bit. So it's naturally going to expand. So I don't know if there's any sort of limiting principle that is going to maintain this small scope of this limited security. But he also mentions a correction through monetary policy. But I think if he were around today, he would reverse track on this idea completely. I think if you were around to see what the Green New Deal proposal is today, or the increased advocacy of modern monetary theory, he might consider rewriting this part of the chapter. But the main point here is he is thinking through these ideas rather than shutting them down completely, which is something that, when you talk about people who don't at least think through these ideas and explain them, that's a lot of modern conservatism is just rejecting it and saying, student debt, yeah, it's a problem. Let's just cut it off here. And people who are in debt, they just got to pay for it, right? That's not always a great response if you don't actually flush out the idea a little bit more. And that's something that at least Hayek, I think, would write a chapter on what to do on that. But I do think he would reverse track on a lot of this stuff and be like, okay, monetary policy, that's not a great thing to dabble with, because that's really what's been screwing us, I think, a little bit more than anything else. To think that after the New Deal, that the Green New Deal will be proposed and actually advocated for publicly, that's pretty crazy. So I would really be interested to see how he would, because I guarantee you he'd rewrite the beginning of this chapter, at least, if you're around today.
Oh, totally. I think so too. As an aside, I wonder how difficult it would be, because we've had that same thought 100 times, right? What if Hayek was here today, X, what would he say about this? I wonder how hard it'd be to get a hold of the guy who wrote the preface and assembled all this stuff to try and to get his thoughts on it. That's an aside, but it might be worth looking into.
Bruce Caldwell.
So Hayek, he addresses this, right? So he addresses the tension. That's what he's doing in this chapter. And so, this first part here is where he's saying he's respecting the question. He's respecting the question of what do we do about these things? And now is where he moves into kind of the consequences of where he talks about that pursuit of absolute security can become the greatest threat to your freedom. And so now he gets into what happens when security, because the distinction he makes in the definition between limited and absolute is in the limited sense, he's saying that's not a privilege. If it's something you work for and earn, that's not some privilege conferred. It's just what you got from your work. Whereas in the absolute sense, it is a privilege conferred, and it can only be conferred to a limited group of people. And so he gets into what he means by that. He says, no wonder that in consequence, the value attached to the privilege of security constantly increases. And so he's talking about this sentence picks up after a thought. So I'm going to tell you guys what the thought was. But he's saying, in a system where absolute security is a privilege conferred. So he's saying, in that type of system, in what people like Lasky is advocating for, or AOC or Bernie would be advocating for today, that the privilege of security constantly increases, the demand for it becomes more urgent until, in the end, there's no price, not even that of liberty, appears too high. So he's saying, once you're pursuing absolute security at all costs, and you're seeing, like you said, people on the outside going, well, I want that. I'm left out. I'm out in the cold. I want that, and it becomes a thing that people are trying to fight over because they realize only a few people can get it. That's what we talked about at the end of the last chapter, the breakdown of society. Once people understand, oh, if we're going to planning, someone's having their life planned and someone gets to do the planning. There's a scramble to be one of the planners. It's the same thing here. There's a scramble to do whatever you got to do to get that privilege of security, even at the cost of liberty. And, I think, again, here's that, take a shot, but the COVID here, we've seen that the population, whenever there's some sense of urgency, some sense of a new threat or that's manufactured, I think largely, at least for most of the population, obviously not saying COVID isn't a thing that can kill people. It has killed a lot of people, but the threat to the total population is small on average. But you're seeing people saying exactly what he says here, that there is until the end, no price, not even that of liberty, appears too high if the demand for security becomes more and more urgent. So what's the news? Delta space AIDS is going to kill us. And so this new demand for security is so high. People are like, take my liberty, take my freedom, to try and get me some kind of sense of security. But even this is one of those things where it's like, and I think Hayek talks about this. I can't remember which chapter it was. You can remind me here, but about in the wartime where there is a planned economy, people do give up some of those liberties, but they actually get, what you might call a good ROI on that investment. They get a good return on investment on what they're doing there by giving they're getting in line with the planned thing during war. It's like, okay, yeah, we got to make tanks. Okay, we need to make tanks.
That was like the first 1 or 2 chapters he talks about that, but also in the introduction, he talks about that because after a re-release later on, he actually got to see oh, I kind of predicted this right. We had a wartime economy. It kind of boosted the economy. And then they're like, all right, let's use this temporary wartime economy as our permanent economy moving forward. And he's like, well, that's an awful idea because that, again, is strictly a planned economy in a sense that at the time it's useful. It's useful to have a wartime planned economy if you're in war. For a very, very short temper. But again, we're talking about temporary that gets spaced out to absolute at some point. So beware, even when it makes sense to do it, be cautious.
Yeah. And at least in the wartime, I think the example he gives, like with a general, this may be in chapter 2, where he says there are, like you said, those limiting principles because it's like when the war is over, it's over. And so they actually have, an intelligible yardstick to measure that. But what with the COVID thing we're seeing now is people are saying, take all my liberty. I'm okay with giving up this freedom. And what are they even getting in return for it? It's a freaking placebo, man. In a lot of cases, obviously there are some people where it makes sense, but I would say that's probably less than 5%, 10% of the population. Maybe that's probably an underrepresentation, maybe more. I would need to see what percent of the population is over the age of 70. But even then, it's like, okay, get vaccinated and you're fine. Probably, if you're older, but either way, the ROI on giving up freedom in exchange for security in this situation is very different than like World War II and so on and so forth. But the main point is, I don't want to deviate too much on that because I'm sure we will later go back to it, but is that people, whenever security becomes a thing that's a privilege conferred, people don't want to be outside of it. They want to make sure they get that thing, and they will. And especially if there's a sense of urgency, whether real or perceived, they will get caught up in it. It's like that. If you look at if you study of like mobs and crowds and stuff, where people just get so caught up in the moment that they don't really think about it, and they're no longer acting individually, but they're acting as part of a collective, even mentally. That you see this with this like, take my liberty, shut up and take my money, shut up and take my liberty, so I can have this sense of security. And we're seeing that today. That's my point, is that Hayek understood this part of human nature. Again, these are people, they aren't prophets. They just understood how a thing works when it's allowed to work, how it works. They understood human nature. And we saw it today, where it's like, yeah, people don't fundamentally want freedom. They fundamentally do want to be taken care of. And that's exactly what Hayek is saying right here.
Yeah. And I even think,
go ahead.
Well, I even think when you're talking about the expansion of this limited blanket of security, the people on the outside looking in, the problem with it too is it's not like the people outside looking in are always people who are, poor and destitute and like really need it. It normally takes care of those people first. And by the time that expands out far enough, you're talking about people who are well off, being like, you talk about COVID, the payments and tax credits for children right now, that they're just paying people who have kids just cause, right? Like, why, if I'm over the limit and I don't get any compensation for my child via tax credit or a direct payment, I think they're direct payments right now. Like, why, just because I make good decisions, I went to school and I'm, well off, like, why do I not deserve to be compensated by the government just because, I have kids and I'm in the same circumstance meaning having kids? It's like, why do so I'm the one paying into it. My taxes are getting taken, redistributed to someone else. And now I don't get any benefit from it, which, is a true privilege over there, but I'm not being privileged at all. So even in the case that you don't absolutely need it, you're still on the outside looking in. That's going to build class resentment right there. If you want to really, really flush that out, something, class resentment has never really been a big thing in America. That's why they always focus on race, because they realize they can't do the same thing in Europe compared to America. But that is a great way to start it up if you really want to do that. And that is what happens when that's the arbitrariness problem inside of security. Like, if you can't picture that easily, picture it there, and that how we've already seen it in the very limited way that security has been applied, but now growing in the past couple of years because of COVID.
Yeah, and I mean, it's the same thing with the student loan stuff, where people were like, what if I made my last payment, paid off my student loans this year, and then they just forgave everyone's debt? Like you said, what better way is there to create resentment of people who worked hard and made the right decisions? Anyway, than by having them be left out of those things. So Hayek continues with this quote where he says, if you want to leave them the choice, if they are to be able to judge what they ought to do. And so I'm gonna pause right here, because transitioning from the quote we just read to this quote is not going to make sense probably to people without talking about what he's saying here. Is he's saying, okay, look, he's making another contrast. If you have a system where security is a privilege and it's conferred, you're going to lose your freedom because you're going to just give up anything to get that conferred privilege of security, that absolute security. He's saying, but in a system where people are able to choose, which is different than what he just described, with the absolute security, if you want to leave people a choice of what they should do, what occupation they should pursue, again, we're talking about in a free system, if they're to be able to judge what they ought to do, they must be given some readily intelligible yardstick by which to measure the social importance of the different occupations. So we're talking about if you're free. Even with the best will in the world, it'd be impossible for anyone to intelligently choose between various alternatives if they offered, choose between various alternatives if the advantages they offered him stood in no relation to their usefulness to society. So he's saying, in a free society, you have to have an intelligible yardstick, which is prices, money, those kinds of things, which we'll get into, in order to tell what you should or shouldn't be doing. This goes back into previous chapters where he's talked about whether it's actually the one economic security and totalitarianism, I believe, is what it's called, where he's saying if you don't get to choose your occupation, then you have no way. None of this revolves around contributing positively to society if it's being chosen for you. And so you have to have something in order to choose. But if you're in a system where what the pursuit is like some type of total security, you're answering to someone else, someone is planning your occupation for you, like, you have no way to know of what you're doing is actually useful to society, if it's a value to society, because you're not given a price, you don't know anything about the supply and demand of that thing, because it's just being dictated to you. You're not choosing it in a system where you actually understand where you have clear information coming in to explain what you should or shouldn't be doing. So just as an example, like today, since we live in a free society, I know that I probably, if I was going to pick an occupation, I probably shouldn't make my occupation someone who fixes, well, yeah, unless I live in an Amish community, I probably shouldn't become a carriage, someone who repairs wagon wheels or something like that, or repairs riverboats, riverboat wheels or steam engines or something like that, because I have the information where I can look and see how much do those people make? Like, how in demand is that job? Not really in demand, but in a society where everything is dictated to me, I don't know if what I'm doing is valuable, and therefore my investment in it, just even personally, is going to be very disconnected from it. So yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, Kevin.
No,
I don't know so much to think there.
What you got is explained there is the brilliance and the undercover brilliance, I would say, of a price mechanism in a free market system. Is you're compensated based on your value to the market, which is your value to the people spending money on your particular product. So we need to think about this, especially the exchange of capital, in a way that we should see money as a carrier of information. I've listened to someone explain it to me this way before, and I forgot who it is. So, credit to them. List it in the comments if you know who it is. But you see money as a carrier. So it's like a carrier of information, like a cable is between one house to another conveying information. This money should act like that information. And when in a completely free, laissez-faire economy, I know exactly how much my skills and my time is valued at because of the way I'm willing to get compensated. Now, if you add something into that system, the constraints into a free market, you can even take something as simple as minimum wage into that. What you're doing is you're adding noise into the system. So now you're adding noise into this wire that the person, I'm trying to convey information from one house to the other. The person at the other house is now getting my information, but now it's staticky. It's noisy. They cannot grasp every little detail that I'm trying to give to them. You add more barriers into the market like this. You add UBI, you add, government guaranteed jobs. You add all these different things, these different types of security blankets. Now there's a whole bunch of noise in the system, and you can't expect the person in the other house to get any of the information I'm trying to convey to them because it's so noisy, it's so staticky. They don't know like what their actual job is valued at. And they can't make an intelligible choice based on, what the value is of that job to society. So you're completely replacing that, and it needs to be filled by something, right? So the idea here is the planners will now give you that information, but they can kind of manipulate it any way they want to, which will really, there's no way to create more prosperity through that system because they have to build their, social, their kind of hierarchy of ends that they believe is best for society, instead of having us as consumers through the price mechanism get to tell the producers, what we value and what we value most, and what's going to give us more meaning in our lives. Yeah. And then he goes on to talk about like the more serious consequences of a planned economy. So he goes in here, quote, "While the last resort of a competitive economy is the bailiff, the ultimate sanction of a planned economy is the hangman. As neither the risk nor the gain falls on the individual, decisions cannot be left to his personal judgment, but whether he does what he ought to have done according to some established rule which must decide. A mistake he ought to have avoided is not his own affair. It is a crime against the community, which should be treated as such. He may be economically secure so as long as he satisfies his superiors, but his security is bought at the price of the safety of freedom and life." So you're quite literally trading freedom for security, which ultimately just means your choices are not your own. He talks a lot about choice leading up to this chapter and how important choices are, because that is what provides meaning to your life. Now you're in a system where, sure, you get to make choices, but those choices are no longer your own. The consequences for those choices will be dictated by the planners, not by, when you make a mistake here. A good example is when you make a mistake, you may have, a temporary injury to yourself in that mistake, but you can transform that injury into some sort of important life lesson, right? You make a mistake, you learn from it, you move on. But now this mistake, this relatively small mistake, is a crime against community, the nation, and the social body. Your mistakes are no longer your own, which means the planners are obligated to everyone else that they have to plan for to determine your punishment. And that's where this true it's not, I mean, corruption is a word for it, but servitude, that's you're serving the planners in this instance.
Yeah. And I think it's really important, this is, a part that if we had like highlights or clips, I would say this is, a bullet point that people need to understand. In a competitive society, people will still break the law. People might still try to cheat to get ahead. That's what the bailiff represents there in that quote, is the enforcement of law, and common law, English common law, blind justice, as we've referred to before. But in a planned economy, where the risks and the penalties and gains and whatever all doesn't fall on yourself, it falls on the planner. They're going to use the hangman. They're going to use death. I mean, that's the Trotsky quote, right? He who does not eat, or he who does not obey does not eat. It's death. He says death by starvation, but death. And so that's the differences here in this society, in a planned society. And this one quote, again, get your shot glasses ready, where he says, a mistake he ought to have avoided is not his own affair. It's a crime against the community and must be treated as such. Like, where are we seeing that today with masks and vaccinations, right? If you don't want to wear a mask, or if you don't want to get vaccinated or something like that, that's not a risk for you. That's a crime against the entire community. And credit where credit's due. I understand the argument there of like, you're putting other people at risk, potentially, whatever. But as we get more data and see what's the actual contrast of the risks that you might be putting someone, in, it has been greatly exaggerated and inflated by, in order to uphold the narrative. And so that's where we're getting all these articles about resentment. And if you're not wearing a mask, you must be a bad person. Or if you're not vaccinated, you're an anti-vaxxer, like drag, stupid idiot, threats to society.
Trump supporter.
Exactly. Yeah. You're a Trump supporter, terrorist, whatever thing. And so this is where this collectivist ideology kind of hive mind thing, this is what he's talking about here. It's not your personal thing. It's not about your choice, but it's about the whole community. And so you're going to get this response, and you'll be treated as a threat to the community, which again is what we're seeing here today. So one of the things he says here that I think is worth getting into, whenever we were talking about this last night, there's this section where, so we go through it, and it's like, okay, there's not like a smooth transition to it necessarily, but we need to talk about it if we're trying to actually summarize the chapter. Is Hayek, once again, giving the devil his due, says, look, let's say you do want to opt into the thing where you trade your freedom for some security, right? Where you want to do that. He says, we actually have an example of this. He says the military. He calls it the security of the barracks. And so he spends a pretty good deal of time saying, look, we have an analog for this kind of thing where someone might want to opt into a system where they don't have a lot of freedom. Everything is dictated for them. They take their orders, but they're given this type of security. What would they call it? 3 hots and a cot, right? That you would get if you join the military. And so we have this, but the point that he gets into is he says, look, that's a section. If you were to take all of society, that's one wedge in the pie chart where you can opt into trading your freedom for a certain type of security. We have this at there's other like private sector things where you can do this. You can sign up to go be so like in Antarctica, they have these research bases, right? And they need people like cooks and custodians and things. I know a guy who did this. You can sign up to go there for like 6 months, or I think the other one's like 14 months. And obviously your freedom is pretty limited if you're on a research base in Antarctica, especially if the movie The Thing is to be believed. Great movie. But anyway, that's the thing where you opt into it. But the point is that these parts of society where you can trade your freedom, like being on a fish, let's say a crab fisherman, or being on a merchant vessel, whatever. There are all these parts of society where you can opt in to exchange some freedom for a certain type of security. But the point that Hayek makes here, especially when he's talking about the military specifically, is that you can also opt out, right? That there is another part of society where you have more freedom than you had over here, maybe less security, but more freedom that you can opt into if you don't want to be a part of this anymore. So if your service is up, if you've served your time in the military, or, whatever, if you want to, I mean, you could take the dishonorable discharge if you wanted to go AWOL or something. But the point is that that's not all of society. And if you turn all of society into that, now you've made it where there is no free thing that you can opt into. If you, I think the word he uses, if it becomes too irksome for you, the security of the barracks becomes intolerable, too irksome. So there is no place where you can opt into. And the quote he gives is either both the choice and the risk rest with the individual, or he is relieved of both. Or he's relieved of both. So again, Hayek is saying, we know what this looks like there. And if someone wants to do this, they can. He gives an example of what I would say is on the very other end of that spectrum. And again, the chapter, I think, Economic Control and Totalitarianism, where he says, if a person doesn't want to work very much, they live a carefree life, they just want to work a little bit and accept the risks of that, they should be able to. And here's the other end of the spectrum, where if a person wants a very structured, organized life and they don't want to make a lot of decisions for themselves or something like that, and they're okay just being told, where to go and what to do, and I'm not saying that pejoratively, that's just what they prefer, they can opt into that. The point is you can opt into either of them, but if you make all of society a militarized, he gives the other example of like ancient Sparta, where, young boys are entered into the, I think it's the agoge or whatever, at a young age, and all of your life was dictated to you. If that becomes all of society, there's no free spot where you can opt into in order to opt out of your life being planned for you. And so then in the next section, he kind of gets into, once again, he mentions this in so many other parts of the book, and he will in future parts, where how people can, opt into or vote themselves into systems of tyranny, vote themselves into, I called it being cliffed out, where you can get yourself into a place from which there is no return, and how they could actually, on accident, create a militarized society, or a society where everything is planned for them, even if they don't mean to.
Yeah, I do like, he constantly pounds the idea that with choice comes risk. You have to accept the both. And it's people that are so risk mitigated, which risk mitigation creates really poor conditions in a free market, because a healthy market incentivizes risk. You want risk to make sure you're making all these new products and new services. But for people who are just so risk averse, it's like, I'll take my security, I'll give up my choice. That's totally fine. And that's a behavior that, if you force other people to do it, which goes to this next quote, if you force other people to do it because you say I'm doing it, therefore everyone else should, that becomes a serious problem. So he goes on a quote here that originally the context around this quote is referring to, I believe, voluntary military service versus mandatory military service, but I'm going to apply it to something else here. And I bet you can guess what I'm applying it to. So we brought it up 100 times already. So get your shot glasses ready. But quote, the proposals of this sort have in the past proved so little acceptable is due to the fact that those who are willing to surrender their freedom for security have always demanded that if they give up their full freedom, it should be taken away from those not prepared to do so. So yes, you can apply this to military service, but you can also apply this to the general population. And guess what? COVID restrictions. I mean, you talk about people who are vaccinated, who are demanding everyone else get vaccinated. They're people who made a choice, actually made a conscious choice here, who are demanding others no longer make a choice. And you can do all the mandates, the mask mandates, the mandates versus freedom of choice in general. Not having kids in school. These talk about the teachers unions, like, well, we don't want from some more notorious reasons, I think they want to keep their staff out of schools, but
heroes is the proper word, Kevin. Come on.
Yeah. I'm sorry. We're going to have a 10 minutes of silence after this for heroes. But yeah, it's, you're seeing it today, man, at full steam, that you're seeing this division between people who voluntarily gave up some of these rights and just said, okay, I'll submit to, what the government, the experts want me to do. And now they're getting mad. I mean, they're told to be mad, at the other side, by the media, by politicians, by, every damn advertisement you see between any sports game or during the Olympics to force people. And there's a thing that came out today that the CDC paid $3.5 million to I think the NFLPA to push the mask stuff. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, they're literally trying to take choice away from people who say, you know, I just want my choice. I mean, even players who get vaccinated say, you know, I chose to do it, but I want people who don't want to do it not to be forced to do it. But it's this kind of, you know, resentment saying, you know, I gave up my freedom. That means you should give up your freedom too.
Yeah, and I love how you said that they're saying it was my choice to do so.
Mm.
But, you know, like I said in that live stream I did on Locals last night, it's like, is it really, if conditions become so intolerable for you, if you don't do it, is it really choice?
Mm.
Yeah, I saw you tweet about that. The other question, and I think the question you asked in that tweet was, okay, where'd the CDC get the money for that again?
Yeah, $3.5
like, the
million.
CDC isn't a business. They're not a business.
Well, they create bullshit.
That's
sorry, we're not supposed to.
That's true.
Whatever.
But they do generate. They do generate that, I guess. So it's tax dollars that they, you know, paid in order to do that.
All right. So this next part gets into like how not only you know, what the problem is when there are people who are willing to give up their freedom, point to the other people who are not willing to give it up to start doing it, but they actually starts to understand that they're conditioning to start believing that it's actually in their best interest for everyone to give it up. So I think this is a pretty good section here. Quote, in a society used to freedom, it is unlikely that many people would be ready to deliberately purchase security at such a high price. But the policies which are now followed everywhere, which hand out the privilege of security, now to this group and now to that group, are nevertheless rapidly creating conditions in which the striving for security tends to become stronger than the love of freedom. The reason for this is that every grant of complete security to one group, the insecurity of the rest necessarily increases. If you guarantee to someone a fixed part of a variable cake, the share left to the rest is bound to fluctuate proportionally more than the size of the whole. And the essential element of security, which is the competitive system, in which the competitive system offers the great variety of opportunities, is more and more reduced. The more security becomes a privilege to be granted rather than earned, the greater the danger to those excluded from it. The higher that security will be prized in the end. When obviously if there's less security, the more that security is going to be prized in the end, because now it's like this big thing held up to, and it's like, okay, I want this privilege because now we're seeing the lack of privilege appear everywhere else. To continue, as the number of privileges increase and the difference between their security and insecurity of the others increases, a completely new set of social values gradually arises. It is no longer independence, but security, which gives rank and status. So basically, as we create a society ever more reliant on security granted by the government, freedom diminishes along with the desire for it. Like, people, once they see all the security being handed out, it's like, okay, freedom's now, you know, it's not even in my purview anymore. I'm just looking to get the security because I don't want to fall behind everyone else. So it's this kind of conditioning that all of these programs that promote security is going to, you know, get freedom out of the minds of everyone else in the population. And so this results in a society built on privileges. And by privileges, like I said before, it's actually a real privilege in which a rule or law actually benefits one group over another. And that creates a new hierarchy of class based on rank and status of one's relation to government power. Now, a good modern day example of this is China, who uses what they call a social credit system. So if you understand it's a regular credit system, there's different variables that go into your credit score when you get it back, so people can look if you're, you know, the risks they'll have to take in order to loan money out to you. This is kind of the same thing, where they'll build a credit score based on different social behaviors. And now the important thing is the social behaviors are determined by government. So whatever social behavior they want you to have, they want you to value, that is what they're going to rank higher. Also, it also ranks your trustworthiness is the word that they actually use. Like I told you before we started this thing, I actually looked up on some websites to make sure I'm getting the terminology right. And they actually use trustworthiness. So all these sources were like advocating for it and how it's a good idea. And like I said, I read as much as I can until they said, all right, accept all cookies. I'm like, no way. If you're going to stand up for communist China, I'm probably not going to accept cookies on this one. But I mean, trustworthiness is one of the big things in there. And like, how Orwellian is this? That is insane. One, yeah. I mean, you'd think that, I mean, America, I don't want to say back in the day, but America is inherently their population is inherently untrustworthy of its government, which is a good thing. I think that's what makes this place great. And if you build this social credit system, if you add a lot of weight to trustworthiness, well, you're changing the whole dynamic now. Like, this is the 21st century version of I mean, fascism, communism, and you call it anything you want, is to make the population submissive to the governing class. And then this is quite literally the road to servitude, is to implement stuff like this.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I mean, I would say back in the day, I would not proceed in terms of saying that the American population distrusts its government without that asterisk, because like he says right here, the more security becomes a privilege to be granted rather than earned, the greater danger to those excluded from it, the higher will security be prized. As the number of privileged increases and the difference between their security and insecurity of others decreases, a completely new set of social values gradually arises. It is no longer independence, but security, which gives rank and status. So there was a point in time, and I mean, this is something that I've talked about multiple times. I know we've talked about this, where it's like people used to value independence because their independence and freedom, they could see a direct relationship between their freedom and their own prosperity. You know, you could use privileges here, you know, as a stand-in for the concept. But once privileges are conferred by some government, you know, thing, or by planners, then that's what he's saying. This new set of social values gradually arises. Again, I'm going to hold off on the incremental transformation of society until we get to the very end. But he's saying people will no longer value independence, but they'll value security, because that's what gives rank and status. And, you know, again, credit to James Darien of Commutation Construct. He did a video I think it was last year, where he talked about the ROI, or the relative value of like liberty, and how people don't perceive a value in liberty near as much as they used to, because of things like this. And I think that's exactly right, that people are much more willing to gamble with liberty and freedom and trade it away. That was the question that I asked James Lindsay during one of the Q&As in Tampa, was, you know, how do you get people to understand what they're actually gambling with here? Because they don't see liberty and freedom as valuable, so they're willing to gamble really highly with it and be reckless with that liberty and freedom. And so, like, yeah, you do have to have a distrust of government. You do have to have a fundamental value of freedom in order to oppose tyranny. But if you have a society that gradually changes in terms of its values, that now it's like, well, I just see security as being the thing, and I don't see liberty and freedom as having like any role in my own success, then you're going to give it away, and you're going to vote yourself into tyranny and servitude, like you said. And they'll opt into and be okay with crazy things like, you know, social credit systems and stuff, because it's like, well, what's the big deal to me? You know, I mean, again, I give the example as of, you know, talk about just what a stupid idiot ideologue or naive, you know, whatever moron I was. You know, I thought the Patriot Act was fine. I'm like, I'm not breaking the law. Why do I care if the government's spying on me? It's like, that's the dumbest thing. If someone said that today, I'd be like, you're an idiot. But it's like,
that's what everyone
it
said
helps.
at the time. By the way, it's
Yeah.
that wasn't lefties. That wasn't just a conservative. That was like 97%. I'm going to throw that out there, because that's the people who believe in climate change. 97% of all scientists, but 97% of like all people, like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like, why? It's not going to hurt me. I don't care.
But that's how those values gradually change, right? If like that type of widespread, insanely naive sentiment can only exist in a society where the values have changed as such, where people don't see
also
the risk of something like that.
Yeah. Well, also the naivete increases drastically when there's a huge catalyzing event, you know, 9/11 or like COVID. You know, there's this large catalyzing
January
event
6th, which is worse than 9/11 from, I have it on good authority.
It's like basically 9/12.
Exactly. 9/12 in Pearl Harbor. And it's the literal Terminator Judgment Day that Sarah Connor talks about, all wrapped into one. So
yeah, that's in the latest Terminator movie, right?
probably. But anyway, so that being said, he talks about, again, we're going back into like security, people trading security for or trading freedom for security. And there is this quote in here that I wanted to highlight, just because it talks about that kind of that corruption you mentioned earlier, where he says, there has never been a worse and more cruel exploitation of one class by another than that of the weaker or less fortunate members of a group of producers, so think like small businesses, for example, by the well-established, which has been made possible by the regulation of competition. So think about like Amazon during lockdowns, Amazon, Target, Walmart, they did great. It was the small businesses that were really hurt by that. The same with like minimum wage laws. That's why Amazon and these other big companies like, yeah, minimum wage laws, we can afford it. We can take the hit. Mom and pa hardware store down the street, they can't. And so I think that was just worth mentioning because we're seeing here's once again a principle that Hayek outlines. One thing we are actually seeing some people on the left, I think, are highlighting better than the right now. Even someone I will put, to be honest, in terms of economic policies, like someone like Sagar and Jetty on the Hill is way more on the left and progressive when it comes to these things. But people like him who have said this is a huge transfer of wealth from small businesses and middle class to the upper class because of these regulations and lockdowns. And it is cruel and it is exploitative and it's totally facilitated by the government. And he gives a quote again, once again, talking about these types of measures tolerated or supported by the government. Hayek says, the general endeavor to achieve security by restrictive measures, guys, whereas there's that C word, the general endeavor to achieve security by restrictive measures tolerated or supported by the government, some might say mandated by the government, by the state, has in the course of time produced a progressive transformation of society. So this pursuit of security, this pursuit of absolute security by means of restrictive measures mandated by the government is creating this transformation of society. So then going back to a quote from earlier, no wonder that in consequence, the value attached to the privilege of security constantly increases. The demand for it becomes more urgent until the end, no price, not even that of liberty, appears too high. These policies created a transformation in society, and that becomes cyclical, where it makes it where they can enact more of these policies, which once again normalizes these values and changes the values, which makes it where they can act even more radical versions of these policies. So we can have these crazy, like, imagine 100 years ago, like if the federal government tried to tell people in some city in Oklahoma that a business couldn't be open, like they would be like, no, what are you talking about? Like, this is insane. They wouldn't allow that. People would not, the dude would not abide that kind of thing. But this general endeavor to achieve security by restrictive measures, lockdowns that are, mandated by the state has in the course of time produced a progressive transformation of society. So I know I've read that quote like 3 times because I think it's worth repeating. That's Jesus. Peter, do you love me? Peter, like if something's important, you repeat it multiple times. So this is what he's talking about. And this is the transformation of society that we've seen where people are totally okay with things. Something like you or I would look around during this COVID stuff. There's your shot, guys, and go, how would you think this is okay? Why do you think a vaccine passport is a good idea? How can you have no red flags about mandating experimental vaccines for pregnant women, things like that? But that can only happen when the values change so much. I think you mentioned earlier where people are just totally isolated, they're hermetically sealed, and they're just brought up in some type of thing where they don't know any better. That's Yeonmi Park. She's another one where I feel like we talk about in every single one of these because she's seen it in real life, in real time in North Korea. And she's warning about the same stuff happening here. And you can see her in tears in a lot of these interviews. Like, this is what I left North Korea to avoid. And I'm seeing it in the United States, and people are not listening, and they are not alarmed by this the way they should because of that fundamental transformation of society, progressive transformation of society.
Yeah, I totally agree. That first quote you put about the actual privileged people or the less fortunate groups of producers of the well-established that have made possible by regulation against competition. That's a large complaint on the left is how wealthy and powerful Jeff Bezos is and Walmart. And I think we talked about right before we started recording about, different movies that give a different message in reality than people think it does. So like a movie like Get Out is a good example of people thought that was a movie about racism, where in reality, I don't know if Jordan Peele's intention was this way, but in reality, how it came out is like, no, if you're a black person, you should probably be aware of rich white liberals because they just want to use you in any way they can. So they again, I don't know Jordan Peele's, political affiliation or anything like that, but they especially the comments on it when it first came out, like they think it's this one thing, but it's actually this other thing that's hurting them. This is an example of, shutting down businesses or Fight for 15. That is this thing they believe is really good, but it's accomplishing the exact opposite of they want. That is increasing this wealth gap. And the people at the top who actually understand what's happening, they know this. They know this is going to create a better marketing campaign, effectively, to say, oh, look at all the bad stuff. Keep voting us in, and we'll change it. It's like Joe Biden's been in government for 48 years, but he's going to make changes now, people, if you vote him in for president. So, it's this foundation they're laying for this confused messaging system that allows people to say, or allows them to message out there, say, hey, vote for your party, vote for your team, vote for us, and then just kind of ignore what we're doing. Just, make sure you continue to vote for us and continue moving the ball forward.
This is not my original quote, but I think it applies. And I just think about this all the time when it comes to progressive policies. I think actually Quentin Tarantino uses to describe agents in Hollywood, but progressive policies and policymakers are arsonists disguised as firefighters. I'm going to create a bunch of catastrophic outcomes and through my policies, and then be the person here to solve it's Munchausen's kind of stuff. I'm going to be the one to solve the problems that I created, to look to me to solve the problems that I created. And the whole time I'm going to blame these catastrophic policies on other people. Soul writes about this all the time, where it's like, oh, if only we'd have had more money, that's how we can fix it. And it would have been way worse if we didn't do this stuff. It's like they're arsonists disguised as firefighters.
Well, that's public education now. It's like, oh, we're failing, but only if we had more funding. If we'd stop defunding education like that's ever happened.
Right.
But yeah, so this is kind of, I think we're heading toward the end of the chapter now, but he kind of summarized it here with a lot of these different themes that we've gone over. So, quote, nothing is more fatal than the present fashion among intellectual leaders of extolling security at the expense of freedom. Those intellectual leaders we all know and love. It is essential that we should relearn, frankly, to face the fact that freedom can be had only at a price, and that as individuals, we must be prepared to make severe material sacrifices to preserve our liberty. So this brings us back to the old phrase of freedom isn't free, and with great freedom comes great responsibility and risk. Security takes away some of the responsibility and risk, but only for a short time, because as Benjamin Franklin once said, and this is when I first even read the title of this chapter, it's like, this is the first thing that went to my mind, that Ben Franklin famously said that those who give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. When people read that, there are different ways you can read that. I've told you that my experience in talking with the what I would call now castrated conservatives or Lincoln Project conservatives who argue against this and say, well, he just said temporary safety. It's like, well, don't trade liberty for temporary safety because it's just temporary. It's like, well, no, everything is packaged as this security blanket that will always be there, to make sure you don't fall down and you have all the essentials and you have everything you need. Daddy government's going to take care of you, and he's not going to go out. Daddy government's not going to go out to the gas station one day for a pack of cigarettes and never come back. This is what temporary freedom is. It's always going to remain temporary security. It's always going to remain temporary because really there's no incentives there to maintain it once they have absolute power and absolute security. And now they can change and create arbitrary rules and laws to manipulate the economy, manipulate the people in any way they want. Again, look at China right now. This is exactly what they're doing, and they're trying to create a world power out of it.
Yep. I mean, that's when he talks about the present fashion, and of course he's writing in the 30s and 40s when he says that intellectual leaders extolling security at the expense of freedom. There's a few things there. One of them is their freedom is not really diminished in the same way that, regular people's freedom is diminished in these circumstances. The people who could work from home and have no real diminution of their income were the biggest ones advocating for lockdowns, right? It's like, doesn't affect my life. What's the big deal? The arsonist disguised as a firefighter. And the other issue there is, again, to get into what Eric Hoffer discovered, is freedom is a burden for some people. That's why this is always going to be a problem. And you have to do as much as you can to preserve freedom as a value in society. You have to hammer that home because it is not the default state of things. It just isn't. There's always going to be people. I heard Michael Malice say this the other day, and I think it's really good, where he said tyranny can be achieved. It's not about a majority. It's about, can a well-organized minority outmaneuver a disorganized majority, which they absolutely can every single time. And so if you get a well-organized minority of people that either are authoritarian or find freedom to be burdensome and therefore want to create this structured planned society, if the majority isn't organized, if by nothing else than some type of coalescence around or agreement on the general principle of freedom, a value of freedom, a value of liberty, a value of independence, then that well-organized minority of intellectuals, like intellectualizing, doing this stuff, they will outmaneuver us and be able to instantiate these values into like the education system, like you mentioned, and progressively change those values of society where independence and freedom are things that aren't valued, and that'll change it, and they'll make it where people, like you said, they'll think, well, it's just temporary and it has no limiting principles, it has no guardrails on giving up this freedom. But gosh darn it, we do need that safety and we do need that security, and we don't want space aids Delta to get us. So it's like this is a thing where I think it might be also Franklin as someone who says freedom is always no, it's Ronald Reagan. Freedom is just one generation away, right? The chain of freedom is always just one generation away from being lost or being broken. So, and that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And unfortunately, we are now in a society where people just don't see it as valuable. It's that Eric Hoffer thing where it's like, this is a burden. It's my ineffectual self. I don't want to be held down or be beholden to my own failures. So I would just rather someone take the reins for me. But the problem is, again, they are bringing us along with them. They're saying, because I don't want to be free, then you also can't be free. And I've seen people, because it creates a test case, right? If you allow there to be the freedom, then you can have a contrast to your crazy dystopian reality where people might want to do more of that, and then you'll lose people because this is obviously a more prosperous way to handle things. So you have to make it where it's like no one gets freedom, everyone has to operate within this limited thing, so there is no contrast, which again, that's something Yeonmi Park has talked about. But yeah, that Franklin quote, it's one of those things where it's like increasingly I'm thinking that, and I'm thinking the H.L. Mencken thing where it's like people don't want to be free, they just fundamentally want to be taken care of. And it's the example I've said multiple times since the election. It's fine if you want to piss in your pool, but don't piss in mine. But that's what they're doing by spreading these crazy ideas out there. They want to bring us all along with them.
Crazy ideas, but sometimes I think it's infantile ideas, because I think they are returning, and I think it even makes sense that they want to lower the voting age to 16, is because this is the mindset of a child.
Oh yeah.
I'm dependent. I'm looking at my parent. I've said this several times to you before. It's like, as a kid, you look to your parent as if they know everything. Like they know right and wrong. They know, if you get lost somewhere, all you got to do is find an adult and they will know exactly what to do, exactly who to call. Then you become an adult and realize we're all big kids who have no idea what we're doing. And we're just trying to go through life and not get in a car accident. That's the government that is run by people who think just like you. Is like, I have no idea what I'm doing. But so we're all incompetent to a very high degree, that I think we look to people. It's like, oh, this guy's got an American flag pin and has the blue or red tie. That must means they know exactly what they're. No, these people are bumping through life just like everyone else is, and they're not going to have better ideas than you are, especially how to run your life.
Probably not. Yeah, and they're not going to be as well or as invested in running your life well as you are. But I mean, there was this. So I think it might have been like Arthur or something. My wife had some show on for our 2-year-old a couple weeks ago, and the theme of the episode, they kept playing this song over and over again, and it was, when you get hurt, find a grown-up to help you feel better or make you feel better. And so it was like they kept getting hurt. This whole episode was just kids hurting themselves. And then the mom, who was like a nurse, would bring the first aid kit out, and I was like, well, first off, they should probably make a distinction between like any adult and like someone but it's exactly what you said. It's like they can solve it. They'll find the authority figure that can take care of it. And of course, there's some ways that's true. It's like, if you're a kid, you should probably go find your parent if you're bleeding. from the eye. But this general notion of like you said, is we have this idea of they know everything, they can solve it. Someone, I think what is this is like an old meme where it's like, if you want to feel really like good about yourself, think about the fact that the people you went to high school now or went to high school with are now raising kids. Or whenever you think your life is going badly, remember there's someone you went to high school with who's still trying to make it as a rapper. But it's like, it's true. Like, the adults don't know anything either. Like, we don't know anything, but then that includes these tunnel vision experts. And that's not to cast aspersions on people who have legitimate expertise in some of these load-bearing institutions, but the general notion that every expert is an actual expert, every person who they just label it on there, at CNN starts experts say, it's like, okay, expert in what? Like you said, some of these people are just bullshit artists, who they bring on because they'll parrot the right talking points. There are obviously experts, as many, if not, more on the other side of those issues that would have opposing viewpoints. And that's the problem you run into.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, it is teaching your kids to be like, oh, find an adult. Like, sometimes, you'll find your parents. Sometimes you're going to wander into a van with no windows and,
free
like,
candy spray painted on the side.
Exactly. It's not always the best, but you talked about like intentions here. And I think that does a good job of moving us into the summary of chapter 9, which is, when people guarantee you some sort of security, they might be well-intentioned. That doesn't mean that things are not going to go horribly wrong. So, he makes the distinction here of limited security and absolute security, and how those are different. And he argued, Hayek goes on to argue that this really, really matters. And I'm not 100% sure of us are on board with Hayek here. And I don't know if we've ever disagreed with him in any major way throughout this book, but I think here is somewhere that, if he were to be here today, I think he'd totally change his tone on this and rewrite this part of the book, because he would see how, it seems like limiting principles on these will just fall to the wayside. And some of them, like manipulating monetary policy is just a bad idea. But at least he gives recognition to where security stands in the way, of freedom and competition. He does understand that there are limits that we must put on any sort of security. And once it starts to infringe on competition and free choice, that it will inevitably lead to servitude.
Yeah. I was trying to find that quote from the beginning, where I think it was Bruce Caldwell, where he talks about the wartime stuff, like you said, where there's no limiting principle. What makes these examples even more worrisome than true war is that none has a logical endpoint. Each may be invoked forever. And I think that principle there is exactly the problem here of, there is no limiting principle for these standards of living, because they're going to change, they're going to be subjective. And so they can invoke them ad infinitum to enact more and more, restrictive policies, or seize more control from people in order to enact these policies.
Or they put people in there who truly believe that, again, going to the beginning with those 3 people, they truly believe that security is a prerequisite for liberty.
Yep.
Instead of the other way around.
Yeah, exactly. Never mind. Yeah. So in the next point in the summary, so he says, as the privilege of security constantly increases. So again, what we mean here is, in this planned society, as you move more and more away from freedom, people giving freedom away for security, as it becomes more and more a privilege that's conferred and people want it, the demand for it increases, it becomes more and more urgent to have that, until at the end, no price, not even that of liberty, appears too high. And again, we can relate this to the COVID stuff today. Like, people were hysterical about trying to feel safe, double masking, quad masking, whatever. I don't know if quad masking is a thing. It's the joke that I make. But you see this. I mean, whenever you see someone driving in their car by themselves with a mask on, or outside in their yard by themselves with a mask on, it's like we're not in the orbit of facts anymore, right? We're not in the orbit of science, of medicine. We're not anywhere close to that. We are in an entirely different realm, and that's a faith-based realm. I told you before we started, I was watching that Peter Boghossian interview on the Woke Reformations Locals last night. And one of the things he talked about is the importance of disconfirmation and like someone being able to challenge, like, is there a piece of evidence that would get you to stop doing what you're doing? And with a lot of and if not, then you are holding a religious belief, or you're holding a faith-based belief. It's not a belief that's rooted in reason. It's not a belief that's subservient to facts. It's a belief that's subservient to like what you want to be true, or your own subjective values. In other words, if facts would not change that belief, if you got enough discordant evidence from that, would you change it? Then it means that the belief is not based on facts. And so whenever we see these people who are making these decisions to give away all their freedom for security, and even in places that it's just so bizarre, double masking on a beach by yourself, and then walk into the car with that, we've left that. And the point is we're seeing that with the COVID hysteria today. And one of the things that I'm afraid of is it's not just the values, but it's this social pressure that is going to maintain this type of thing, into the future. But this is what happens when security becomes a privilege that's conferred by elites, not something that you gain for yourself. And as you've mentioned, I think quite astutely, that it's not good enough to take that on yourself. You also have to force it on other people who do not want to be subject to that same value hierarchy. And again, I'll say it one more time, guys. So I'm sure your vision's a little blurry, but we're seeing that with all the COVID responses today, and it's only going to get worse from here.
Yeah. If your vision's blurry, it's probably not the Delta, it's the drinking. But
exactly.
Surgeon General's
it's the echo variant.
Oh yeah. And then the third and last point we came as a summary from this chapter is trading freedom for security changes how we get information about the wants and needs of society. The information about the value of a service or product used to be transmitted via the price mechanism to help us determine what we ought to do in order to profit personally while simultaneously adding value to society. But a society which deals in security as the primary currency or value over freedom transmits information, if at all, as dictated by those with high enough rank and status in that system. This creates real privilege, and the real sense of privilege, and returns us to a time before economic freedom. It eliminates economic freedom. And Hayek ultimately argues that the cost of absolute security is our absolute freedom resulting in tyranny. He does mention, the difference between limited and absolute, but limited tends to always trend toward the absolute security. So you have to be aware when anyone's offering you this security blanket, especially sponsored by the government, some centralized entity, coercive entity. That's a big one because there's a difference between the communal security, having a security blanket offered by your church or something like that is different. They're not coercive entities. This is what a centralized government has, is coercion here, and that is something you cannot escape. You cannot get out. You cannot voluntarily get out of that situation, and you don't want to go down this road to servitude, because at some point you just can't turn around.
Yeah, and I think to kind of, I know we literally just did this, but I think it bears repeating, is these are problems that are worth addressing. The problems of the tension between risk and reward, security and freedom, are all things that are worth grappling with. And that's why Hayek doesn't ignore these as problems. And that includes what to do about the less fortunate in society. Okay, fair enough. Hayek's main point here is you cannot, one, create this crazy subjective value. And actually, I think we didn't even get into it, but there is the quote where he gets into the minimal standard of living, and what do you do when it comes to international relations, whenever one country, just by virtue of being a citizen there, has a higher standard of living in another country. And he says these are things we can't take lightly. And so my point is that these are, if we're trying, the point of doing this book is to marry it to our contemporary realities. The problem that he's discussing there is a problem that remains today of what do we do about the less fortunate? What do we do about these, quote, acts of God? What do we do about problems that people can't necessarily foresee or avoid or prepare for? Or if they could prepare for it, maybe they're not adequately prepared, whatever. Those are good questions. But Hayek's main point here, and this is something you hear a lot today articulated by, conservative pundits and thinkers, where they're we agree on a lot of the premises of these problems. We just disagree on the solutions. And Hayek's point is, I want to take this seriously. I understand we have to figure out a way to do this. We have to figure out a way to handle this. And we can't like ignore these problems, which is one thing I respect about him, because a lot of modern conservatives just ignore some certain problems because they, I don't know why, ignorance, naivete, maybe Tucker Carlson doesn't talk about it, so neither do they. I don't know. But his point is, if we follow this route of too much security, in the YOLO sense, or agoraphobic, you just end up back where you started, where you have no freedom. And the difference is at least in a society where you're free, but you have very little economic security, you can transition out of that. Your freedom might be limited by your economic situation, but you can utilize the little freedom you have and leverage it to gain more freedom and more economic security. And then it becomes a positive feedback, right? In a good way, is that it feeds itself. But if you trade all of your freedom for this one type of security, you end up in a system where you can't leverage that security to gain more freedom. It doesn't go the opposite direction. So it's much better, like you said at the beginning, to have a system where you're going to have to work in order to get food. You might not want to work, and it might not be work you want to do. It might not be a job you want or anything like that. But it's better to have a system where you have to work in order to get food than one in which only those who obey, the powerful, are able to eat, are able to have any type of security whatsoever. Like, there's no question that the first one is far more preferable to the second one. So it seems like I just wanted to bring it back to these are contemporary questions of today. The issue of risk versus reward, freedom and security, especially with the COVID stuff, and how each person wants to take this personal choice. Again, the CDC website says getting vaccinated is a personal choice. Well, it's not if your employer mandates it and requires it, or if you work for the federal government, they require it, or whatever. It's not a personal choice, but these are things that we will always have to grapple with, is the tension between security and freedom, risk and reward. And the point is you want to have a society that maximizes freedom so that ultimately it's your decision to make how you want to balance those things. Not some planner, not some bureaucracy, but it ultimately falls on you. Whether you want to be the person that works a little bit, doesn't have a lot of economic security, but you have a lot of freedom, free time, whatever, or you want to join the military and have everything planned out for you. The main point is you want to live in a society where, one, we do have some system, ideally a communal thing, that addresses the less fortunate, but two, where the individual has the freedom to at least try to leverage that freedom to transition from any of these different aspects of society and hopefully rise up, because you can't leverage that government mandated security in the second instance to try and get more freedom. That's not how it works. That's getting cliffed out.
Yeah, there's the theme in a lot of the chapters prior to this one is the theme of choice, and needing to be able to be allowed that freedom of choice, because that's the prerequisite to all other freedoms.
Yep.
And in this chapter, he dives into something that's just so relevant today, and that is the choice to give up your choice. It is convincing people to voluntarily give up their freedom for the sense of security. And even as he explains at the beginning of one of the quotes, that it's like, why in a system of freedom that has prospered this long would people do that? Well, it's a slow, gradual, these large catalyzing events, them saying this is in your best interest. You got to protect grandma and grandpa. You got to do all these things to make sure the kids don't get hurt and they can go back to school. The only way they can go back to school is to be vaccinated. There's all these things that culminate into the centralized idea of just allow us to make the choice for you. Like, freely give up your choice so we can make it for you, and that is how you can go from a free liberal society into tyranny and authoritarianism extraordinarily fast. So I like how this chapter lays down that foundation, and now we're going to be getting into at least 2 chapters here that are going to be just massive, and I'm pretty excited. So this is chapter 9, and in chapter 10 that we'll be doing next week is why the worst get on top, and then chapter 11 after that is the end of truth. Both of those are going to be huge chapters that are extraordinarily important. I mean, the one at the end of truth, I mean, people have written volumes on that, just on that central idea, and to get Hayek's understanding of how it fits in here economically and socially is going to be quite insightful, I think, especially from back in, again, 1944. So we were prepared to have him say something back then as like, oh, duh, why aren't we getting this in 2021? It's amazing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to read. I'm really excited. I've been really excited for both of those chapters this whole time, and also his last summary when he gets into like the propaganda war and stuff is really interesting. But whenever you said this question of today of the choice to give up your choice and this greater good, I wanted to read two quotes from these articles that I took screenshots from about the COVID vaccine stuff really fast, just because it ties into this. Is that cool? If I read these really fast. So here's a quote from someone. I think this is from CNN. Those of us who got vaccinated, we want to live our lives, Tolford said. The way to do this was to get vaccinated, and we've done it now, and you guys still don't want to put other people first and put the greater good of society first. So maybe you guys just go stay home. Maybe it's time for you guys not to be able to do everything because you don't want to participate. And here's a quote from an NBC article where another person, these articles stoking resentment, saying manufacturing resentment to kind of play on Chomsky. Quote, I find myself doing all these extra things and being thoughtful because I learned from my grandmother not to just care for yourself, but to care for your neighbor, Brian said. Now I'm getting to the place where I'm angry that I see other people not doing the same, not getting vaccinated when they can. Don't we all want to get back to normal? And so this is that thing where it's this collective. It's like, I made these choices and you have to also. Like, don't you care about the greater good? Hayek's talked about that, right? The name of the greater good, I forgot what the other one is, the common good, or that kind of thing. That's
Common
what
welfare.
Yeah, common welfare. And these are the same kind of arguments. And it's you're a bad person and you can't be trusted if you don't want to. If you don't want to make the choice to give up choice, like I did, then you're not on board with the greater good. And like he said earlier, these aren't about individual risks. You're now putting society at risk, and it's going to be treated as a community risk, a sin against the community. Rather than to yourself. And so that's exactly what it is today.
Yeah. So trade away a little bit of freedom just for that security there. While I think we just passed 500 days of 15 days to slow the spread. So these limited principles aren't so limited, I suppose.
Yep.
But
and it's literally temporary security because we all have to get booster shots too. Like so long,
yeah.
Right?
If you think we're ever going to go back to normal in any way, as long as the people in power want to keep pushing this stuff. And it's super unfortunate because it is, a serious disease. I know we kind of joke about it here, but it's something to obviously take seriously, but facts and evidence are also pretty important. And without those, how are we supposed to make an informed decision? And with people withholding that information or citing, pick and choosing what data to cite, like the CD does very, very often, which is why they flip flop in every issue. Like, how are we supposed to make an informed choice? Because that's part of the choice, is being informed about it. And when you see an entity seemingly purposefully lying about this stuff and hiding certain things, like, why would you trust them? I'm now my informed choice can be like, okay, I'm going to go away from them because they don't seem to be doing what they tell me they're doing. So people are make choices depending on what they're given, and you can't blame someone for making a choice you didn't make because they're uncomfortable with the risk being taken.
Yeah. Hopefully the next chapter will explain a little bit of why our current leaders are who they are. Why did the worst get on top? Because that is exactly what we're
the Dr. Fauci
now.
story, subtext.
That's right. It seems like a good place to end it there. What do you think?
For sure. So make sure to find Truman at the return to reason or just return to reason.locals.com or at My Mundane Mind on Twitter. Also, you publish on medium.com. So just search Return to Reason on Medium, YouTube, and ThinkSpot.
That is correct.
Anywhere else? No? Good.
No,
Hopefully Rumble soon, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I never made that account, but I probably need to. I was too busy day drinking honey whiskey at the Bozeman airport. Important stuff. But yeah, I haven't published it. I need to publish something on Medium because I haven't written stuff. I've got so many like unwritten or unfinished things on Google Docs. Anyway, that's another thing. So same with Kevin. He's at ENG_politics on Twitter, engineeringpolitics.locals.com. He actually does publish stuff and write things consistently.
For a while.
Way more than I do. And so he puts that on there, and on Medium, he actually keeps his ThinkSpot up to date, whereas I don't. So follow him on there. And I think he does upload stuff to Rumble and YouTube. Kevin is criminally undersubscribed to on YouTube and on Twitter. So please be sure to do those, but join the Locals community. Those are the number one priorities as well. And I think, is that it? Did I get
That's it, man.
Yeah. What should I do?
What do I do with my hands?
My hands.
All
right, guys.
That's from.
It's fine. Thank you for watching, everyone, and we will see you next time. Peace.
See ya.